So we wanted to take moments out to carve out some time and talk about some of these other advanced planning strategies that if it serves as a conversation starter or something we can talk, either after this meeting in between our normal meeting cadence or what have you, we'd love to do that. Michael Scott on the team being a CFA and myself being a CFP and Matt being a CFP as well. Our job is to stay up to speed on all these different laws and changes and things that are happening, whether it's taxes or financial planning. And specifically for today, I like this topic because it's kind of like the perfect marriage of two somewhat complicated planning strategies that all of our clients, especially our retirees, face, which is RMDs and charitable giving. So again, feel free to ask questions along the way, and we'll do our best to monitor those. Michael, are we up and running with those yet?
Yeah, so I have the chat turned on right now. So us as
Perfect.
panelists and hosts, we should be able to message everyone, or we can message you indirectly. As participants, your messages are just going to come through to John and I as hosts and panelists. So feel free to ask whatever you want. And if it's timely, right as we're talking about something, we'll hop in and answer it then, or we may
Yeah.
wait to the very end to answer them. So I'll be monitoring this back and forth while John's presenting, and if anything comes up here, we'll be sure to get to it. So, John, that being said, you want to start us off and get it going?
Yeah. Yeah, man, absolutely. Shout out to Megan, Joyce, and Brandon, who all texted me and said, no, chat is disabled. So while I was doing that intro, I was getting some text saying it was disabled. So, okay, if anyone that has seen us do presentations, Michael and I do a lot of these together, Matt as well. And I love just starting with like the most alarming statistic you could ever see. And so I came across this one in our research and preparation for this, which is that 84%, a recent study done by JP Morgan Chase suggested that as many as 84% of retirees might be making RMD mistakes. Now, that seems pretty aggressive. It might be a little outlandish, but let's say that's even half that. Let's say that 40% of retirees are potentially making RMD mistakes. That's 40% too many. And what I've seen over the course of my career is it usually comes in five forms. It's taking too much for your required minimum distribution. Oh, it did a thumbs up because I'm on my Mac. That's cool. It's taking too little. It's not having the tax withholding correct. So, you think you hit the nail on the head with taxes. You find out next April that you have a big tax bill because of this. Giving it away incorrectly. That's going to be kind of the crux of the second half of this meeting is talking about how to properly give away your RMD if you're charitably inclined and that's what you want to do. And then incorrect timing, just simply understanding the timing of some of these things that need to happen. And what I've learned is why that typically happens is either lack of information. And certainly, hopefully, our clients that are on here with us today don't have to worry too much about that because that's kind of what we see our job as is to make sure that we're making well-informed decisions. But I typically see it's lack of information or lack of organization. We've got, I've seen this a lot where someone's got three different IRAs, a couple 401ks from old employers, and it becomes really complicated to manage the RMD when we have this disorganization throughout. And so again, goals for today, for those of you that remember learning the five W's during our grade school days, the who, what, why, when, and where. We're going to go over the five W's of required minimum distributions, and then ultimately strategies for managing the RMDs and then potentially giving your RMD charitably. And then, of course, Q&A. So as Michael said, we'll monitor, try to answer throughout, but we will either, if we don't answer throughout, we'll try to get to that at the end if we have enough time within the 45 minutes today, or we'll get with you one-on-one and answer those questions. So Michael, why don't you take it away? Let's dive right in to the five W's of RMDs.
Absolutely. So I think one of the most, or probably the second most confusing thing with RMDs is who does it apply to? In theory, it's pretty simple, right? It's people that have IRAs and have achieved age 73 in life, right? But that wasn't always the case. As recent as a couple of years ago, we had Secure Act 2.0 that came through, and that changed the number to 73. Originally, it was 70 and a half. I think we moved up to 72, then we got to 73. And again, this number is going to change in 2033, that number goes up to 75. So actually who RMDs applies to changes over time. And that's just standard. We haven't even begun to talk about inherited IRAs because they come with their own set of rules for RMDs as well. So realistically, simply put, It's people that have achieved age 73 in life. You may have inherited an IRA as well, or you may have began taking IRAs or began taking RMDs earlier in life at 70 and a half. And then one of the key things is when does this or what accounts does it apply to? How does this occur? For the most part, we think about this as traditional IRAs, but we still have to take RMDs if we have money in SEP IRAs or simple IRA plans, even 401ks, 403bs, 457 plans, really any retirement plan that's out there is subject to an RMD once you achieve age 73 in life. And the way this is qualified or calculated is based on tables provided to us by some of our best friends at the IRS. And they create these life expectancy tables that we have to use to calculate the RMD every year.
Michael,
And
hey, can I ask a question that I think
sure.
maybe some people are listening to? I've had this question come up a lot. What about Roth IRAs?
So Roth IRAs in general are not subject to RMDs. However, if you inherit a Roth IRA based on some new tax law, there are RMDs or there could be an RMD that would apply to you. So in general, we're just talking about IRAs when we talk about
Yeah.
RMDs. However, there are some Roth IRAs that can have an RMD as well. Great
Right.
question,
So like
John.
your own Roth IRA that you set up, no, but and then we'll put a pin in the inherited stuff because we're going to get to the inherited accounts later. Perfect.
Yep.
Thanks for answering that.
So one of the other tricky things about RMDs is when do they have to be taken? And again, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, it's by December 31st of each calendar year, with one exception. The exception being the year in which you turn 73 currently, which will become 75 in the future, you are allowed to delay that RMD until April 1st or tax time of the following year. Though in that situation, you will be taking two RMDs in that following year. So there's potentially a tax problem there, but that is the one opportunity you have to delay it. Now, a lot of our clients ask us, what to do with their RMDs, and most of the time, RMDs are just paid out to your non-qualified accounts, such as your individuals, your joints, your trust accounts, or we send a check or an EFT to your bank account on record. We are not allowed to move uh, RMDs from a IRA to a Roth or to another account, however.
I'm
Um,
glad you said that. I get that. I know I keep like throwing the Roth in there, but I get that question a lot is like, hey, I don't, why do I have to take this to begin with, which we'll answer next, but like, I don't want to take it. Can I move it to my Roth IRA? And of course, the answer is no,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
And the answer and the reasoning behind that we'll get to in just a second here. But the other opportunity that comes up, and one of the reasons we're talking about RMDs this year is the QCD or the Qualified Charitable Distribution. And we're going to get very in depth on this in just a minute. But the QCD allows you to take a distribution from your IRA, for example, your traditional IRA, and send it directly to a charity or a 501(c)(3). And, there are obviously limits and logistics with this, but it allows you to make a donation to charity and not include this on your income taxes every year.
So in summary, like the IRS actually really doesn't care what you do with it as long as you take this required amount that you need to take out. They don't care if you put it into another investment account, if you spend it to go on a cruise, if you just put it in savings. They don't care. They just want to see it come out of the account.
Yeah, they just want to see it come out of the account, and that's really the why. Our friends at the IRS, their job is to gather revenue for the government and keep us honest, right? At the end of the day, and I know you have a couple pieces of information on this, we all got tax breaks putting money into 401ks, IRAs, 403bs, whatever the plan was for years. And now we have all these assets built up. And in theory, when we're in retirement, we're going to pull them out to live on. However, everyone's situation is a little different. And with proper planning, you may be delaying these distributions from your IRAs for as long as possible. And now the IRS wants their money. Now the government needs the revenue. And that's really why we have to take money out at the end of the year, is to generate revenue for the government.
Yeah. Well, you're gonna see a theme on my talking points, which is I just like throwing out landish data out there. So I did a little bit of research here, but there is approximately 39 trillion in assets in the United States inside of retirement accounts. Now some of these could be Roth IRAs too, but I thought, gosh, that's such a large amount, and it makes sense. Like the IRS, to the point you said, Michael, is the way they look at this is, hey, we let you put money in here, get a tax deduction when you put it in, and it grew tax deferred. We're ready to we're ready to tax you. And why they want to tax you, obviously it makes sense. They want their tax revenue, but you can kind of see like how significant it is. So I had to make some assumptions, several assumptions to get to this number. But you look at this 39 trillion, which is almost just like a very hard to comprehend number to begin with, and we take some assumed averages for RMD rates of about 4%. And then we take an assumed, I did some assumptions on tax rates, and it estimates that it generates about 300 billion in taxes for the IRS. And so they want to make sure you take it. And here's the thing, what I've learned over the years is I've had clients ask me like, all right, John, what if I forget or what if I don't want to take it? I've had this come up a lot of times too, Michael, with Medicare. Folks are like, I don't want to go on Medicare Part A and Part B. I want to stay on my plan that I have. What if I don't want to? Well, they kind of force our hand into it because they penalize us if we don't. If we don't take this distribution in accordance to their rules, it's a 25% failure to take penalty. That is a penalty that's assessed on top of the fact that it's taxable as well. So this penalty used to be 50%. In recent years, I would say in the last 2 years, I believe, it went from 50 to 25%. Couple good things though, for folks that are listening to this and you're like, oh man, I have a friend who turned 73 and missed it and forgot. This can be abated. If you take the corrective distribution within 2 years, you can actually have it reduced down to 10%. I have seen folks actually successfully reduce it to zero if we kind of state our case to the IRS. So we can work within some of these rules, but the penalty is so substantial that obviously they force our hand, right? So it's kind of funny because the IRS penalizes you if you take your withdrawals too early. For IRAs, that's 59 and a half. So if you take money too early from your retirement account, that's a big no-no and you get in trouble. And if you wait to take it and you don't take it at a certain age and you wait too long, that's also a no-no and you get in trouble. And so another common question that we usually get then is, okay, great. I get the why. I understand that I need to do it. But then like walk me through, how does this arbitrary calculation work? Is it just some percentage that they take? And the answer to that is like sort of. It's a little more complicated than that. Michael, do you mind explaining a little case study on this?
Absolutely. So it is arbitrary in the sense of the IRS had to come up with a methodology of creating the RMD. Um, they use actuaries' studies of demographics to understand what's the probability of an individual or a couple living to a certain age. And that's the oversimplified way of how we get to the table on the right here. So at age 73, you have a divisor of 26.5. So here in our case study, we have Ellie Thompson just turned 73 years old, and she's now required to take a distribution from her IRA. The value of the IRA on 12/31/2024 was 800,000. Now, in this very simple calculation here or example, we're only talking about one IRA. What's key to remember here is what if you have two IRAs? You have two RMDs. Now, similarly, how the IRS wants you to take the money out, they don't care which IRA you take it from, but you have to take the appropriate amount. So in this situation, Ellie has 800,000. She's 73. So we go over and take the divisor of 26 and a half. We divide 800,000 by 26 and a half, and it gives us a number a bit under $31,000 as an RMD for that. Now, if Ellie here had an extra account or she had a second account, we would have to add that up as well. And you can take it all from one as long as you satisfy the total amount. Um, but we need to be careful But we also need to be cognizant that an RMD stands for required minimum distribution. Everyone's financial plan and situation is a little bit different. So
Mhm.
this is only the minimum you have to take out. If your life situation says you need more than that, you're allowed to take more than that. This is just required minimum at this point in life. And as you age, you can see the number gets smaller on the right side. And as that number gets smaller, the distribution amount required every year would get bigger as a percentage of the assets.
Yeah, I like that you explained that. I mean, because I've had this happen a lot with folks where, like you mentioned, three different IRAs, and it's do I need to take three separate RMDs? Not necessarily. You just need to account for all three of them, know what the number is in totality, and you could take it from one. And situationally, sometimes we do that. I had mentioned, Michael, by the way, we did get a question about QCDs, which is coming up in about two slides. So we're almost there. But Michael, I had mentioned we'd put a pin in the inherited IRAs because this is interestingly for folks listening to this, if you're like, all right, the RMD stuff's, already complicated enough. Well, it gets infinitely more complicated with inherited IRAs. So we're referring to usually non-spousal accounts, right,
Mhm.
Michael? Where someone inherits an account, and there's a lot of trickiness in these rules pre 2020 or post 2020. Do you mind shedding a little bit of light on that? We can maybe just kind of go back and forth on this one.
Yeah, so in an effort to make things more simple, naturally, Congress and the IRS made things a little bit more difficult. Pre-2020, we had rules on how to take RMDs. So, in this, we'll start with this piece because this has not necessarily changed. If you are the spouse of someone who passed, you are able to inherit their IRA and get it retitled as if it's your own, in which case you don't have to take an RMD. There are one or two exceptions to that. If you are a spouse that is more than 10 years younger than your deceased spouse, there are slightly different rules on what would take place. But for most spouses, there is no RMD if you inherit your deceased spouse's account. Now,
Mhm.
in an effort to make things more simple, um, and post 2020, if you inherit an IRA, the IRS came out with the rule. It's called the 10-year rule, meaning that if you inherited the IRA, you had to take money out of the account and close that account out within 10 years. And at the time of that issuing, we all looked at that and said, okay, we have a 10-year window to close out this account. This is really great because we know an account has to be closed in 10 years, but it gives us the flexibility to do some planning around it. Maybe you're going to retire in that window and you don't have any income, and we can take it from the account at that point and lower the overall tax bill. There's a lot of different things that can happen. Well, last year, in 2024, the IRS gave us some clarification and guidance on that rule, and that's not exactly what they meant. They did mean that you had to empty the account over 10 years. However, they also stipulated now that if there was an RMD that was already being taken place from the account, you have to continue that RMD. And if there was not an RMD taking place, you have an RMD to take now. So every inherited IRA starting in 2025, moving forward, will have an RMD that needs to take place, whereas for the past 4 or so years, there was not a required minimum distribution. Um, Thankfully, the IRS is somewhat nice in this guidance and saying we're not going to be penalized for not taking RMDs over the past several years, which is a blessing. However, now we have 6 years to empty RMDs that were inherited in 2020 or 2021, so it's kind of a more
Mhm.
compressed time frame. So that's a little tricky. And then there's a multitude of other issues that open up here. What if you're not a spouse? What if you're a non-person beneficiary? There's a lot of other things that go on here that make this actually more complicated. Whereas before we had a 10-year rule, now we have about 6 or 7 different pathways to take assets over 10 years, depending on the situation.
Yeah, I smiled a moment ago when you were talking about, the IRS in an effort to make it more simple, the IRS came up with this because what I think ultimately has happened is it's it's just made it a lot more complicated because there's a lot of interpretation to the rule until they finally clarified it. Then 4 years later, in 2024. So I think to try to summarize this, the best way that my mind works it anyway is if you inherited a non-spousal account before 2020, it will come with a different set of rules. And in my opinion, because I've seen RMDs done this way for inherited accounts for my entire career, it's actually easier to understand. And if you inherited an account after 2020, you're now subject to this 10-year rule. And then I think those maybe more micro questions that a client might ask. For those of you that are on this call, and it's great to see some of these awesome names. We've had, unfortunately, to have this conversation of an inherited IRA account post 2020 and work through this with you. So in those micro details, that's where we'll kind of step in and help. But high level, the effort to simplify it actually, I think, made it substantially more complicated in my
And
opinion. Yeah.
and it's going to be difficult over these next really 5 to 10 years, because if we think about it, over the past 50 years, people in this country have been accumulating IRAs.
Yeah.
And a lot
Right.
of that wealth transfer from the baby boomer generation onward is getting ready to take place, right? And there are a lot of IRAs that are going to switch hands over the coming 20 to 30 years. So in some ways, it's good that this change happened when it did, because it happened preceding a lot of this changes. However,
Mhm.
now we have two sets of rules that we have to run by for the foreseeable future, even though one is going to become more predominant over time, which would be the 10-year rule.
I like that you shared that because that's a really good perspective. I mean, if you go back to the 1980s when people had defined benefit plans, they had pension plans through their employers, it was a little more straightforward. We didn't have these issues to face. Now we've got the invention of the defined contribution plan and then the popularity of it rising from the 80s to
Mhm.
90s and now to current. You're right. I mean, there's a huge, I mentioned, $30 trillion in retirement assets. That is a substantial wealth transfer from one generation to the next at some point, and people will be dealing with the complications of these inherited IRAs.
And the reasoning again, why did this change come about? Points
Right.
back
Such
to
a good
the
point.
points back to the IRS and the need for revenue. Now we've got, like you said, there could be, over $30 trillion, close to 40 trillion in retirement funds. You do the math on that tax purposes, we're going to begin to pull those assets out on a 10-year rolling basis. That really explains kind of why we're here, even though the goal was to make it more simple. The
Right.
money was involved in this situation.
That's such a good point. I mean, I like that you said that. And in the spirit of that, so what are some ways that we can disinherit the IRS? I feel like we're beating up on the IRS, but us and I think every attendee here, we maybe have that in common that we don't think the IRS does things as efficiently as they sometimes should. So, well, I think this is a good like transition point. So
Yep.
obviously there's a plethora of strategies for the folks that are charitably inclined to transfer their wealth. The one that we're going to be talking about today predominantly is the qualified charitable distribution because it goes so hand in hand with this RMD that we just explained. What you'll notice on this list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things, what you'll notice on this list is cash is not there in terms of one of the most beneficial giving strategies. The interesting thing about cash is it's probably the most convenient way to give money, but it's also the most inefficient way to give because it has little
Mhm.
to no tax benefits. And what I've learned is it's not typically practical either. So there's a study that suggests about 5% of the nation's wealth is in cash. And I mean, I would make the argument that our folks on this call today, our clients, our average client has a higher cash to net worth ratio than 5%. But we can probably all agree that if we're deploying the right investment strategies for our situation, cash isn't often going to be like the most sizable portion of our net worth. And so there's better ways to give and do so by and in doing so disinheriting the IRS. And so let's kind of jump into his qualified charitable distribution. Some of you on this call do this and execute this. So this is going to be fun to talk through this because you're kind of seeing a little bit of like behind the scenes of how we view and look at doing these. But it's a direct transfer from your financial institution, your custodian of where your money's held, to an eligible charity. Now, Michael's going to explain here in a moment this, but that part of what I just explained is very critical. So some people think like, oh, I got a $10,000 RMD. I'm going to take my $10,000 and then from there I'll write a check to organizations for that 10 and I'll get credit for that qualified charitable distribution. And the IRS says, no way, no how. We want to see it go directly to the organization or to the institution rather. So there's a bunch of caveats when it comes to doing this correctly. That's just one of a number of them. Michael, where do you want to start with QCD planning?
Well, first I'll mention that was one of the questions we had. Do you have to send the check directly from the institution to the charity? Yes, we still have to do that. So money has to go from custodian to charity, cannot touch your hands, and that has not changed. Now, one of the interesting things about QCDs or qualified charitable distributions is that they start at 70 and a half years old, even though the new RMD age currently is 73, subject to go to 75 again in the 2030s. And it's kind of interesting here because there's a window in which you won't have an RMD, but you could give charitably from your IRA. There's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that, but it's important to know you could do a QCD as early as 70 and a half. You do not have to wait to your RMD age. The other piece of this that's really key here is you can only make this from your traditional IRA or from your rollover IRA. You can't do this, like I said, from the Roth. You can't do this from a simple. You can't do it from a SEP. Really can't do it from retirement plans. You really have to do this from an IRA or a rollover IRA. And again, just like you have to take your RMD by the end of the year, the IRS says you have until the end of the year to do the QCD. We can't wait until January of 2025 to do a QCD for December of 24, the same way we could do an IRA contribution for a prior year. So it's very key that if we want to do these, we have to do them before the end of the year to get them to count towards that tax year. And this is probably one of the most interesting pieces or one of the biggest benefits, is a QCD can satisfy your RMD if done correctly. And I think, John, you and I spent a lot of time talking about this yesterday for a qualified charitable distribution. If you're someone in a situation who is charitably inclined and has different assets and that you're set to receive RMDs that otherwise would go into an investment account or go into a checking account because you're not living off that money or you don't need it. A lot of times you ask us, do I have to take it? And realistically, one of the options for you is to do the QCD. So, like you said earlier, John, if you had $10,000 as an RMD and you didn't need it, rather than taking it and then donating something to charity, it's better to make the QCD happen, send the donation directly from your IRA to the charity, and then that $10,000 doesn't show up on your tax return, but you will have satisfied your RMD. That's probably one of the key things here that the QCD is very powerful for. On the other hand, you're limited to $108,000 max in 2025 for QCDs. This number was set at 100,000, and it's being indexed to inflation. The limit this year is 105. And finally, to count as this tax-free distribution, like we started off with, this must be sent directly to the charity from the custodian or institution. It cannot touch your hands first.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said, Michael. I'm glad that you were mentioning something that made me think of this, and I want to bring this up too. It was regarding you were just explaining the complexity of like satisfying the RMD and the QCD, which we talked through like various scenarios. We won't do that here. We'll kind of talk with you guys one-on-one on that if and when it comes up. But what I kind of realized was you think back to like tax law provisions back in 2018. there was something like, I mean, the statistics were pretty cool to see. It was something like close to, well, more than a third of Americans were itemizing on their taxes prior to those tax law changes. And then when those tax law changes went into effect, it went from like a third to like less than 5% of people actually itemize on their taxes anymore. And so in that transition of tax law change rose the popularity of QCDs, in my opinion, because a lot of people, they would give to a charitable organization, and you could itemize that on your taxes. I mean, that's everyone here listening to this, like you all remember a time where you could do that, or we'd go to Goodwill and we'd donate a bunch of stuff and we'd get a receipt to be able to itemize the deduction on those things. But with those tax law changes really kind of put this in the spotlight. Would you agree with that, Michael? I mean, that's kind of something that I feel like I've noticed in the last several years.
Yeah, it's one of the ways that we can all be charitably inclined and get credit for. Because I think obviously most of the people we work with and probably everyone on this call is charitably inclined in one way or the other.
Mm.
But with the tax law changes from the 2017 tax cuts, you have to be really charitably inclined to get a benefit above the standard deduction, which
Yeah.
is, that's a double-edged sword because oftentimes the standard deduction is more than you would have got if you're itemizing, right? So like there's a
Mhm.
benefit to it from that standpoint. But this QCD, the charitable deduction, allows you to get that deduction even if we're not itemizing. So it brings that back in and allows all of us to get kind of that credit. And at the end of the day, being charitably inclined is, not about getting a tax break, but if we're going to do it, let's optimize it in the best way possible, right?
I'm glad you said that because I was just thinking the same thing. It's, we
Yeah.
give for the impact that it has, not to save on taxes. The taxes is a second
Yeah.
benefit if we can disinherit the IRS a little bit while we're doing it.
Yep. And I know we're going to go into some more complicated examples here and really, I don't want to say itemize, but really calculate the benefit here discreetly. But if we look at this case study real quick, Ellie Thompson gives $30,000 annually to various charities. She has substantial assets in her retirement account, and after turning 73 is required to take a distribution far greater than her need. Along with her investment dividends, she also receives a pension and Social Security benefits. So in this situation, Ellie has a lot of income coming to her that she doesn't need, and she's being forced to take an RMD by the IRS that is going to do two things. It's going to push her to a higher tax bracket, and then it's just going to sit in her bank account or her investment account. When we think about this, understanding the taxes, her RMD will force her to move into a higher tax bracket. Additionally, there's also a surcharge to her Medicare premium as a result of this forced income increase. Again, she doesn't need this money, and it's really going to do three things, two of which are negative and one's kind of eh. So, John, do you want to talk through a little bit of
Oh,
how
I'm
this actually
ready.
plays out on a spreadsheet so we can see what this looks like?
I'm ready. I know Matt's rolling his eyes. Our fellow co-host Matthew Marcoux is often on these with us. And when he likes to talk taxes, right? So when he sees that I do any type of taxation stuff in an Excel spreadsheet, it's not his favorite thing because we have tax software to do this. But for me, I think this is a good visual aid in illustrating this. So this scenario with Ellie is not unlike many clients of ours that experience this. You've got various things on your taxes. So let me just kind of explain this real quick. I'm gonna fly through it a little fast here as we're wrapping up, but this visual I think is really powerful to see the impact of a QCD. So Ellie has interest and dividends and dividend income that flows through her taxes to the tune of about 22,000. She also has a pension. She also has Social Security. You might be looking at this going like, John, why is there two numbers here? Why does one say 33,000 and one say 39? Well, for those of you that maybe have experienced this before, I think everyone has. There's the IRS will do Social Security tax inclusion as far as like how it flows through on your taxable income, anywhere from 0 to up to 85%. In Ellie's case, it's 85% tax inclusion. So 85% of 39,000 is what's listed here. And then she has this RMD of 30,000. So you're looking at this going, wow, 133,000, like that's a lot of adjusted gross income. She certainly should be taxed, at whatever the effective tax rate, marginal tax rates are. But the reality is, like for many of our clients that are in the situation, you're not necessarily like you have dividends and interest that are flowing through on your tax return. That doesn't mean you're like living off of that. You have an RMD that you have to take. That doesn't mean you're living off of that. And so it probably her adjusted gross income shows higher than what it is in actuality. And when, Ellie and most retirees are in this same situation, as long as you're over 65, you get a standard deduction of 15,000 here in 2025, and then you get a $2,000 additional for being over the age of 65. So how we math this out is we have taxable income of 116. We live in a progressive tax country that goes through scales. So, the first 12,000 almost is taxed at 10%, and then from 12 to 48 is taxed at 12, and so on and so forth. So Ellie is in the 24% tax bracket and paying $20,755 in taxes. But wait, there's more. As most of you know and have experienced this as well, there's this thing called the income related monthly adjustment amount. It's IRMA is what that is. And so this IRMA is a surcharge that really, I mean, make no mistake about it, it's a tax. It's an additional tax, and we have to kind of consider it as such. So in Ellie's scenario, her RMD and the combination of all these things, it's actually her. And by the way, IRMA is based on your modified adjusted gross income. So that's like your top line number. So we're looking at her top line number going, oh gosh, she's at 133,000. So if I go over here in this bracket and I take a look, for anybody, even if you're just a dollar over 133, you're going to be paying an additional premium for your Part B, not just 185. Actually, oops, I'm sorry. Let me go down one more. 133 to 167. So her premium's not 185, it's 370 a month. And she's paying an additional premium for Part D. So you add all this up and go, holy smokes, her taxation is at 23,000. So what if she were to, and she's charitably inclined anyway, what if she were to gift this RMD instead? Well, it's kind of got this big multiplier effect and it's a really big swing. What ends up happening is we eliminate the IRMA surcharge because now her adjusted gross income is at 103,000, which is below this level of 106, which is where you start to get that surcharge. And of course, her tax brackets are changed. She's gone into a slightly lower tax bracket, so taxation is different as well. So when we compare and contrast the two, we're looking at about a $9,500 tax savings just by simply changing how she's giving. And I think that's the part of, in uncovering this that I think is so powerful in understanding. And to the point that Michael, you made before, this doesn't work for somebody. We don't want the tax tail to wag the dog, so to speak. Like, we're not saying, hey, give $30,000 or give your RMD just because you don't want to pay more in taxes. But if you're charitably inclined already and you're giving to your churches and local organizations or what have you, this is a strategy that, we want to be mindful of. And certainly, a number of clients that are on here with us today are mindful of it. Again, though, I can't overemphasize the importance of all these like micro steps and how we do a QCD. Michael, I know you wanted to talk about a couple of these talking points just to kind of hit home the importance of effectively doing the QCD right.
Yeah, like you point out there, the benefits can be measured and we can see what it is, which is really cool in our industry to understand like if we do this, there will be an outcome. However, to get that outcome, like you said, you do have to follow the appropriate steps. I think the most important step here is it has to go directly to charity. We cannot go to the bank account first, and we have to be sure to verify where that money is going. That's probably the most important piece. Second most important piece is keeping good records. Just like you get 1099s every year, it's your duty to report this information to the IRS on the tax return. So understanding when things took place, how they took place. If you're working with us, we keep a lot of these records for you and manage them. However, if you're doing this on your own, keep the records because that backs up all the points of how we did different things. Now, just because you have an RMD and you're charitably inclined, and in the situation before we saw Ellie had $30,000 of an RMD, she gifted all 30,000. You don't have to gift all 30. You can gift 10, you can gift $1. Obviously, the benefit varies from a tax perspective on how much you gift, but you're not
Yeah,
required.
I was gonna say let's make sure we're keeping AGI top line income in mind to stay below thresholds. But yes, continue. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, we can have the conversation from a planning perspective on what the optimal number is, but keep in mind you don't have to gift the entirety of your RMD. And then a lot of times we get this other question, do we have to give it all at once or give it to the same charity? And that answer is no. Like we said, timing matters. You have to do it by the end of the year. And to count against your RMD, you have to do it before the entirety of the RMD has been satisfied. But you can gift to multiple charities. So if you want to split your RMD out to 15 different charities, by all means, you're allowed to do that. It might keep the good records piece a little bit challenging, but you are allowed to split up your RMD among different charities, among different checks, among different time within the year.
I'm glad you said that because I mean we actually have a number of clients who do that, who give to, a dozen different charitable organizations. And that's, we help with the record keeping and the organization of it just to make sure it's not something that you need to stress about. But this is a scenario where Matt always likes to say this in client meetings where he'll say like it's all the honor system until the IRS comes and asks for proof. And so likelihood of an audit of the IRS saying like, "Hey, what's going like show us that like show us this," low, but you really do want to make sure that we're keeping good records.
And it's also important when we talk about keeping records before we make the QCD, ensure that the organization we're sending to is a registered nonprofit with
Yeah.
the IRS. And the IRS does keep a database of this that we can go online to their website and we can look it up. But the last thing you want to do is be well intended and give money to an organization only to find out they're not entirely registered correctly with the IRS as an exempt organization. So that's the homework up front that we want to make sure we do.
Yeah, that's a big deal. I'm glad you said that too. Now, Michael will cringe when I do things like this, but I'm going to anyway. I'm not going to call it return on investment, but it's a return on your taxes. And so, in summary, with the example that I illustrated, and this is, it's as close to a real life example as it gets. I mean, we have clients that do this often, but in this scenario, it's a $9,500 tax savings on that $30,000 of giving that the person was already doing just by, a little bit more inefficiently by giving cash instead of their RMD. That's a 32% return on their taxes. And that reduction in the tax bill instead of giving cash is, certainly meaningful. So I know, Michael, you always kind of laugh when I say things like that, but for me, like my mind sort of it helps me quantify decisions. Like, okay, if I'm giving and you're telling me like I got to go through all these hoops to make sure that they're qualified, to make sure it goes the right way. I mean, there's a lot of steps, right? If I can go through all these hoops and the trouble of going through all that's going to save me like a couple hundred bucks on my taxes, I probably don't care that much. But
Sure.
we like to make things tangible and quantify them, and so that's the way that the way that my mind works it anyway. And then finally, of course, there's other ways to give. There's a plethora of ways to give. In fact, and we're, like I said at the beginning of this, our effort in doing these conversations with our clients is to really maybe spark something in a meeting, be a conversation starter, or maybe, like have a meeting after this to talk about some of these specific things. So we're sending out, emails throughout the year, but we will have some planned giving discussions later in the year where we'll talk about other ways to give to organizations in addition to simply the QCD. And then finally, I think, Michael and I always like to end with this, but we love staying connected. Like it's, we love engaging with our clients in ways that are outside of the client meetings. If we get to see a few times a year in client meetings, that's amazing. And we always try to increase that by these types of discussions with you or following us on social at Candor Path. And so there's a number of ways to stay connected. Something that's somewhat new for us. If you go to www.yourmoneystory.app, app, we have an e-course that I've found to be really helpful for family members, so like clients of ours will give this e-course that kind of walks through some basic stuff of like budgeting and cash flow and what's an ETF and what's a mutual fund and that type of stuff. So if that's something that is of interest to you, we'd love for you to check that out as well. Michael, as we're wrapping, which I feel pretty proud of us for staying pretty close to on time. We're only 3 minutes over. As we're wrapping, any parting words of wisdom that you want to share?
Yeah, I think those four words on the right, that our guidance to your journey is really the core of what this one is about, right? This is an opportunity to just optimize or be more efficient with what you guys are already doing. So, like I said, this is about people that are charitably inclined. If you want to give, there are opportunities to make it work a little bit better for you. And we just have to do a couple things to do that. And this is just highlighting one of those opportunities for you.